Summer 1944. Normandy. The Allies have just punched through the German lines at a place called St. Lo. The breakout is on, and leading the charge? Sherman tanks. Now, here's the problem with Sherman tanks. Germans called them Tommy Cookers. Americans called them Ronsons like the lighter, because they light up first time, every time. The Sherman was fast, reliable, easy to produce. It was also a death trap against German Tigers and Panthers. The armor was thin. The gun was adequate, but nothing special. The ammunition was stored in places where a single penetrating hit could turn the entire crew compartment into an inferno. American tankers knew this. They climbed into their Shermans every morning knowing that if a German 88 caught them, they had maybe 3 seconds to get out before the whole thing cooked off. So how does a man driving a rolling coffin become the deadliest tank ace in American history? Meet Staff Sergeant Lafayette G. Poole. Call sign, War Daddy. Poole wasn't supposed to be a tank commander. He started as a Golden Gloves boxer from Texas, tough as nails, stubborn as a mule, and absolutely fearless. Born in 1919 in Odom, Texas, a tiny town where you learn to fight because there wasn't much else to do, Poole grew up during the Depression. He picked cotton. He worked cattle. He boxed in smoky gyms for a few dollars a fight and earned a reputation as someone who didn't know when to quit. When the war started, he volunteered for armor. Not because it was safe, because it was fast. Poole had one philosophy that he carried from the boxing ring to the battlefield. Hit first. Hit hard. Keep moving. While other commanders played it cautiously, hanging back, waiting for infantry support, coordinating with artillery, doing everything by the book, Poole charged straight at the enemy. Head on. Full speed. Sounds suicidal, right? Except it worked. German gunners were trained to hit slow-moving targets at range. A Sherman doing 25 miles per hour, zigzagging and firing, that's a nightmare to track. The human eye and the mechanical systems of 1944 were not designed to hit something moving that fast, while also moving yourself, while also receiving fire. Poole understood this instinctively. He turned Sherman's weakness into a weapon. If you're going to burn, burn while killing. If you're going to die moving forward. That mentality, that absolute refusal to play defense, made him the most dangerous tank commander the United States produced during the Second World War. Let's talk about what Poole was up against, because understanding the enemy makes his achievements even more remarkable. The German panzer divisions in 1944 were fielding some of the most formidable armored vehicles ever built. The Panzer IV was the workhorse, reliable, well-armed with a long 75mm gun, and experienced crews who'd been fighting since Poland, France, North Africa, and the Eastern Front. Then there was the Panther, officially the Panzer V, which many historians consider the best medium tank of the war. It had sloped armor that could bounce most Allied shells, a high-velocity 75mm gun that could kill a Sherman at over a mile, and a combination of mobility and protection that made it terrifying in both offense and defense. And then there was the Tiger. The Panzerkampfwagen 6 Tiger was a 56-ton monster with armor so thick that most Allied tanks couldn't penetrate it from the front at any range. Its 88mm gun, adapted from the legendary anti-aircraft weapon, could destroy any Allied tank at ranges exceeding 2 kilometers. A single Tiger, well-positioned with a competent crew, could hold up an entire armored column. American tankers reported instances of firing round after round at a Tiger's front plate, watching the shells bounce off before the Tiger calmly traversed its turret and destroyed them with one shot. The kill ratios were sobering. In some engagements, German heavy tanks achieved exchange rates of 5 or even 10 to 1 against Shermans. American commanders compensated with numerical superiority for every Tiger. There were 4 or 5 Shermans. The strategy was brutal attrition. Lose 3 tanks to kill 1, but have enough tanks that you could afford those losses while Germany couldn't. Individual American tankers were, in a very real sense, expendable components in a vast industrial machine. Poole refused to be expendable. His first command was a Sherman M401 named In the Mood after the Glenn Miller song that was everywhere in 1944. The name was Apartment Poole, and his crew were absolutely in the mood for violence. They landed in Normandy in June 1944, shortly after D-Day, and immediately began pushing inland against fierce German resistance. The bocage country of Normandy was a tanker's nightmare: high hedgerows, narrow lanes, limited visibility, and German anti-tank guns hidden behind every corner. Most tank commanders advanced cautiously, infantry leading the way, engineers blowing gaps in the hedgerows, and artillery softening up suspected positions before armor moved through. Different approach. He went first. He reasoned that hesitation killed more tankers than aggression. A stopped tank was a sitting duck. A moving tank, firing and maneuvering, at least made the enemy work for the kill. His crew thought he was insane at first. Then they started surviving engagements that killed other crews. Then they started believing. The first week after entering combat, Poole destroyed 2 German tanks. Not disabled, destroyed. Burning hulks with dead crews inside. The second week, 3 more. By the time Operation Cobra launched on July 25, 1944, the massive breakout offensive that finally cracked the German lines at St. Lo, Poole had already established itself as someone special. He was promoted to staff sergeant and given command of a tank platoon. Now he wasn't just killing Germans. He was leading other tanks that followed his aggressive example. The breakout from Normandy was one of the most dramatic turning points of the war in Europe. For weeks, the Allies had been bogged down in the hedgerow country, taking horrific casualties for minimal territorial gains. Then the bombers came, thousands of heavy bombers carpet bombing a narrow corridor in front of American lines, obliterating German defenses and creating a gap that armored columns poured through. Poole's unit was part of the 3rd Armored Division, nicknamed Spearhead, because they were often at the very tip of American advances. And at the tip of Spearhead was Lafayette Poole. The Germans were reeling. Their front lines had collapsed. Units were trying to retreat, regroup, and form new defensive positions. Chaos came. Poole, running down the retreating enemy like a predator chasing wounded prey. His platoon didn't just advance, they rampaged. Poole would spot a German column, tanks, trucks, artillery, and infantry and charge straight at them, guns blazing. The psychological effect was devastating. German soldiers expected American tanks to be cautious, to call for air support, and to wait for an overwhelming force. They did not expect a single Sherman to come screaming out of the dust, firing its main gun and machine guns simultaneously, closing to point-blank range and destroying everything in sight. Poole's gunner, Corporal Wilbert Richards, became so attuned to Poole's commands that they operated as a single organism. Poole would spot a target, bark a range and direction, and Richards would have a round on the way before the sentence finished. They claimed they could go from target acquisition to firing in under 4 seconds. Most crews took 8 to 10. In tank combat, those 6 seconds were the difference between killing and dying. But Poole didn't just have a great gunner. His entire crew was exceptional, and he made them that way through relentless drilling and an almost fanatical insistence on teamwork. The driver, Corporal Bert Cochran, learned to anticipate Poole's commands, throwing the Sherman into evasive maneuvers the instant combat started without waiting to be told. The bow gunner handled the hull-mounted .30 caliber machine gun, sweeping infantry and soft targets, while Richards dealt with armor. The loader kept shells flowing into the breach at a pace that seemed superhuman. Poole called them his family. They ate together, slept in or near their tank together, fought. Sentimental, it was tactical. A tank crew that trusts each other operates faster than a crew that doesn't. In the heat of combat, when decisions happen in fractions of seconds, that trust translates directly into survival and kills. Poole created killers, and he led them by example. He never asked his crew to take a risk he wouldn't take himself. When the tank was hit, and it was hit multiple times, Poole was always the last one out, making sure his men got clear before he evacuated. That loyalty went both ways. His crew would have followed him into hell. In many ways, they did. July 1944. Somewhere in the Normandy countryside, Poole's Sherman takes a direct hit from a German anti-tank gun, a Pak-40, the 75mm weapon that was the backbone of German anti-armor defense. The round punches through the Sherman's side armor. The tank is wrecked. Any rational assessment says the fight is over for Poole and his crew. Instead, Poole climbs out of the smoking hull, checks that his men are okay, and goes looking for another tank. He finds one, a replacement Sherman that had just arrived with a depot unit. Poole commandeers it, transfers his crew, and is back in the fight within hours. This wasn't officially sanctioned. You weren't supposed to just take tanks like they were rental cars. But Poole did it because the alternative was sitting on the sidelines while his division advanced without him, and that was unacceptable. His commanders learned to look the other way. The Poole was worth more in a tank than any rule was worth enforcing. August. (1944). Second tank destroyed. This time it's an 88, either a Tiger's main gun or, more likely, one of the dreaded 88mm flak guns that the Germans had learned to use as devastating anti-tank weapons. The round hits the turret, killing the interior, wounding Poole's loader, and starting a fire that threatens to cook off the ammunition. Poole pulls his wounded crewmen out, gets everyone to the medics, and once again goes hunting for new wheels. The third tank was destroyed. Fourth tank destroyed. Each time, the pattern repeats. Hit, damaged, or destroyed. Crew extraction. Find a new tank. Return to combat. The Germans weren't fighting a tank. They were fighting an idea, the idea that you could be hit and hit and hit and still keep coming. That idea had a name, Lafayette Poole. Word spread through the 3rd Armored Division and beyond. Other tankers started calling him War Daddy, part respect, part awe, part the kind of dark humor that soldiers use to cope with impossible situations. Poole became a legend while the war was still being fought, which almost never happens. Legends are usually made in retrospect, when the dead are safely buried, and the living can agree on what mattered. But Poole's reputation grew in real time, passed from tank to tank, unit to unit, through the strange and formal network by which soldiers share information about who's competent, who's lucky, and who you want to be near when the shooting starts. German commanders started hearing about him, too. Intelligence officers noted increased activity from a particular American tank that seemed to be everywhere at once, destroying vehicles, disrupting retreats, and appearing where it wasn't expected. Whether they knew something unusual happening. Units in Poole's sector reported facing a Sherman that fought like a tiger, the highest compliment a German could pay an enemy tank. That let's pause and talk about what made the Sherman specifically so problematic and how Poole overcame those problems. The M4 Sherman was designed with one primary goal: production. The United States needed a tank that could be built quickly in massive quantities, using standardized parts that didn't require rare alloys or specialized manufacturing techniques. The Sherman achieved those goals brilliantly. American factories produced nearly 50,000 Shermans during the war, more than all German tank production combined. But production efficiency came at the cost of combat performance. The Sherman's 75mm gun was adequate against most German vehicles in 1942 and 1943, but by 1944, The Germans were fielding tanks with armor that the 75 millimeters couldn't reliably penetrate. Sherman's own armor, about 50 millimeters on the front hull, less on the sides, could be defeated by German guns at ranges exceeding a kilometer. This meant that in a straight fight on open ground, a Sherman engaging a Panther or Tiger from the front would almost certainly lose. American doctrine responded by emphasizing combined arms infantry, artillery, air support, and tanks working together to offset individual vehicle weaknesses. But in the chaos of a breakthrough operation, combined arms coordination often broke down. Tanks outran their infantry support. Artillery couldn't keep up with rapid advances, was weather-dependent, and had response times measured in minutes, which was an eternity when a Tiger was bearing down on you. This is where Poole's aggression became a tactical advantage. By closing the distance rapidly, he neutralized the German range advantage. A Tiger's 88 mm gun could kill a Sherman at 2,000 meters. But at 200 meters, Poole was hitting the Tiger's side armor, which was thinner and more vulnerable. At 200 meters, his gunner could aim for weak points: the turret ring, the vision ports, the track, and suspension. At 200 meters, the fight was no longer one-sided. Poole also used terrain brilliantly. He would advance through defilade, low ground that concealed his tank until he was almost on top of the enemy. He would use buildings, hedgerows, and tree leans to mask his approach. By the time the Germans saw him, he was too close for their advantages to matter, and he never stopped moving. A stationary tank is a dead tank, which was Poole's mantra. He drilled his driver to keep the Sherman in constant motion during combat, zigzagging, reversing, and presenting unpredictable angles. German gunners were trained to lead moving targets, but Poole's driver made prediction nearly impossible. The crew's synchronization was key. In a tank engagement, everything happens at once. You're moving, the enemy is moving, shells are incoming, your gun is traversing, your loader is wrestling with heavy ammunition, your commander is trying to maintain situational awareness while also directing fire and giving driving instructions. It's controlled chaos, and the crew that can manage that chaos faster than their opponent wins. Poole's crew had practiced so extensively that they operated on muscle memory. When Poole yelled, "Traverse right, tank, 300 meters," Richard was already turning the turret before Poole finished the sentence. Poole called for a reversal. Cochrane had the gears shifting before the words were out. They had developed a shorthand communication, sometimes just single words, sometimes just grunts that conveyed complex information instantaneously. Outside observers described watching them fight as watching a dance, violent, bloody, and somehow coordinated. Each crew member knew not just their own job, but everyone else's. If the loader went down, others could substitute. If the driver was incapacitated, Poole himself could take over. This redundancy saved their lives more than once. When Poole's loader was wounded in the August engagement, the crew reorganized on the fly, redistributing tasks and continuing to fight with reduced effectiveness rather than bailing out. Poole's kill count is the stuff of legend, though the exact numbers vary depending on the source. The most commonly cited figures are 12 confirmed tank kills and 258 armored vehicles and self-propelled guns destroyed. Those numbers are extraordinary by any standard. To put them in perspective, most American tank commanders went through the entire war without a single confirmed tank kill. The average Sherman engaged in perhaps a handful of direct tank-versus-tank engagements over months of combat. The Poole was averaging multiple kills per week during the breakout and pursuit operations. The 258 armored vehicle figure includes a staggering variety of targets. Panzer IVs and Panthers, yes, but also Stu-G assault guns, Jagdpanzer tank destroyers, armored half-tracks, armored cars, and self-propelled artillery. Poole wasn't selective about his targets. If it had armor and a German cross, he killed it. Beyond vehicles, Poole's crew was credited with destroying artillery. Positions, machine gun nests, supply dumps, and troop concentrations. Conservative estimates suggest that over 1,000 German soldiers were killed or wounded by fire from Poole's tanks during his 81 days of combat. That's a body count that rivals infantry companies and artillery batteries. One tank, one crew, one impossibly aggressive commander from Texas. The psychological impact on German forces is harder to quantify, but was certainly real. German soldiers in Poole's sector reported increased anxiety, a sense of being hunted rather than holding a defensive line. Unit cohesion suffered when word spread that an apparently unkillable American tank was operating in the area. Morale is a fragile thing, and Poole's relentless attacks chipped away at it. German officers later recalled that American armored operations in the 3rd Armored Division's sector seemed more aggressive than elsewhere, and they attributed this partly to a handful of exceptionally dangerous commanders, Poole chief among them. The Poole also had a psychological effect on his own side. His success boosted morale throughout the division. Tankers who had spent weeks dying in the hedgerows saw that aggressive tactics could work, that the Germans could be beaten, that it was possible to come out of an engagement alive if you were good enough and bold enough. The Poole became a symbol of American armored potential, proof that the Sherman, for all its flaws, could kill German heavy armor in the hands of a capable crew. His example influenced a generation of tankers. The aggressive doctrine that Poole embodied attack, always attack, never give the enemy time to set up or aim became codified in American armored tactics. The breakout from Normandy turned into a pursuit across France that seemed almost too good to be true. German armies were in full retreat, trying to escape across the Seine River before American armored columns cut them off. Poole was at the forefront, his tanks covering ground at an astonishing pace, sometimes advancing 50 kilometers in a single day. The French countryside blurred past fields, villages, and forests as American armor raced eastward. Resistance was sporadic but intense. German rearguards would set up blocking positions with anti-tank guns and a few tanks, try to delay the American advance long enough for the main body to escape, and then fall back to the next position. Poole treated these rear guards as opportunities. He would hit them before they were fully set up, overwhelming them with speed and violence. His after-action reports read like a hunter's journal. Targets acquired, targets destroyed, advance continues. Some days, his crew engaged in a dozen separate actions, each one a potential death sentence. Each one survived through skill and aggression. Other tankers in his platoon followed his lead, learning by watching and by listening to his rapid-fire commands over the radio. Poole taught them to close the distance, to trust their training, to keep shooting until nothing was shooting back. WWII September 1944. The pursuit had carried American forces into Belgium. The liberation of Paris was complete, and Allied armies were pushing toward the German border. Supply lines were stretched thin. The famous Red Ball Express, trucking convoys were struggling to bring fuel and ammunition forward fast enough to sustain the advance. Some units had to pause, waiting for logistics to catch up. Poole didn't like pausing. Every hour the Germans had to. Dig-in was an hour they would spend improving their defenses, bringing up reinforcements, laying minefields. Poole pushed his superiors to keep attacking, keep the enemy off balance. Don't let them establish a new defensive line. Sometimes he got his way. Sometimes he was ordered to hold in place and wait. The waiting gnawed at him. He wasn't built for patience. The war had given him a purpose that peacetime never had a chance to use his aggression productively, to channel the violence inside him toward a cause everyone agreed was righteous. In combat, Poole was calm, almost serene. In garrison, waiting, he was restless and irritable. His crew recognized the pattern. They kept their heads down during rest periods and prayed for orders to advance. September 19th, 1944. The date that ended Lafayette Poole's war. His unit was pushing through Belgium, near a small town called Alfit in the Ardennes region, the same region where, 3 months later, the Germans would launch their desperate counteroffensive in the Battle of the Bulge. The terrain was hilly and forested, very different from the open fields of northern France. Visibility was limited. Roads were narrow. It was ambush country, and Poole knew it. His tank, the latest in a series of Shermans named In the Mood, he kept the name each time he switched vehicles, a superstition or perhaps just stubbornness, was advancing along a road when it happened. A German anti-tank gun, likely a Pak-40 or possibly an 88, was hidden in the tree line, camouflaged and waiting. The gun crew had done everything right. They had positioned themselves where the American tanks would be silhouetted against the sky. They had waited until aggressive positioning at the front of the formation was exactly what they were waiting for. The first round hit the front of the Sherman. The impact was tremendous, a blow that felt like the entire tank had been punched by a giant. Poole's driver fought to keep control as the tank slewed. Poole was already yelling commands, trying to orient on the source of fire. The second round hit the turret. This one penetrated. Shrapnel filled the interior of the tank. Poole's right leg was nearly severed, hanging by tissue and tendon, blood pumping out in arterial spurts. Other fragments tore into his body. His crew, the men he called family, the men who had followed him through hell, dragged him out of the burning wreck. They applied a tourniquet to his mangled leg. They carried him to cover while the German gun continued to fire. Medics arrived and got Poole onto a stretcher. He was evacuated to a field hospital, then to a more substantial facility as the severity of his wounds became clear. Surgeons worked to save his leg and his life. For days, the outcome was uncertain. The Poole had lost massive amounts of blood. Infection was a constant risk in the pre-antibiotic era. The shrapnel had done internal damage that took weeks to fully assess. Poole survived. He kept his leg, though it would never work properly again. He walked with a pronounced limp for the rest of his life, and chronic pain became his constant companion. But he survived, the unkillable commander, wounded at last but not killed. The war went on without him. The 3rd Armored Division pushed into Germany, fighting through the Siegfried Line, crossing the Rhine, and driving into the heart of the Reich. Poole heard about it from hospital beds, first in Belgium, then in England, then back in the United States. He received updates on his crew, his unit, and the war's progress. He read about the German surrender in May 1945 from a rehabilitation facility where he was learning to walk again. The war that had given his life meaning was over, and he had missed the end of it because a German gun crew had done their job and gotten lucky with the second shot. The psychological adjustment to peacetime was hard for Poole. Combat veterans often struggle with the transition, and Poole had been one of the most intensely combat-focused soldiers in the American Army. He had found something in the war, a sense of purpose, an outlet for his aggression, a place where his particular talents were not just useful, but celebrated. In peacetime, those same traits that made him war daddy made him difficult. He was restless, impatient, and prone to anger. The adrenaline that had sustained him through 81 days of continuous combat left a void that nothing could fill. He tried various jobs after the war. Nothing stuck. The excitement of combat, the sheer intensity of life-or-death decisions, made in fractions of seconds, made ordinary civilian life seem unbearably dull. He drank more than he should have. His marriage was rocky. He struggled to connect with people who hadn't been through what he'd been through. This is a common pattern among high-performing combat veterans, and Poole followed it almost textbook style. But Poole also found moments of peace. He returned to Texas, to the flat open country where he'd grown up. He raised a family. He reconnected with other veterans who understood what he'd experienced. He gave occasional Reich. Poole heard about it from hospital beds, first in Belgium, then in England, then back in the United States. He received updates on his crew, his unit, and the war's progress. He read about the German surrender in May 1945 from a rehabilitation facility where he was learning to walk again. The war that had given his life meaning was over, and he had missed the end of it because a German gun crew had done their job and gotten lucky with the second shot. The psychological adjustment to peacetime was hard for Poole. Combat veterans often struggle with the transition, and Poole had been one of the most intensely combat-focused soldiers in the American Army. He had found something in the war, a sense of purpose, an outlet for his aggression, a place where his particular talents were not just useful, but celebrated. In peacetime, those same traits that made him war daddy made him difficult. He was restless, impatient, and prone to anger. The adrenaline that had sustained him through 81 days of continuous combat left a void that nothing could fill. He tried various jobs after the war. Nothing stuck. The excitement of combat, the sheer intensity of life-or-death decisions, made in fractions of seconds, made ordinary civilian life seem unbearably dull. He drank more than he should have. His marriage was rocky. He struggled to connect with people who hadn't been through what he'd been through. This is a common pattern among high-performing combat veterans, and Poole followed it almost textbook style. But Poole also found moments of peace. He returned to Texas, to the flat open country where he'd grown up. He raised a family. He reconnected with other veterans who understood what he'd experienced. He gave occasional interviews and talks, though he wasn't comfortable with publicity and preferred not to discuss the war in detail. The killing he'd done weighed on him in quiet moments, not as guilt, exactly, but as a somber recognition that he had ended hundreds of lives and changed hundreds more. War is not glorious for those who fight it, and Poole had no illusions about glory. He had done a job, done it extraordinarily well, and paid a permanent physical price. That was the sum of it. The military remembered Poole even when the public largely forgot. His awards were substantial. The Distinguished Service Cross, second only to the Medal of Honor for Combat Valor, the Legion of Merit, 2 Silver Stars, a Bronze Star, and a Purple Heart for his wounds. Foreign governments decorated him, as well the French Croix de Guerre with Palm, the Belgian Order of Leopold with Palm. These were not participation trophies. They were recognitions of extraordinary achievement, signed off by multiple levels of command after rigorous verification of claims. Poole's official record showed 12 confirmed tank kills and 258 armored vehicles destroyed, numbers that placed him at the top of the American Tank Ace rankings. No other American tanker had a comparable record. Some disputed the exact figures. The chaos of combat makes precise accounting difficult, but no one disputed that Poole was in a category of his WWII in 2000, 9 years after Poole's death in 1991 at age 71. The U.S. Army honored him in a particularly fitting way. An M1 Abrams main battle tank stationed at Fort Hood, Texas, now renamed Fort Cavazos, was dedicated in his name. The tank bore the name War Daddy on its hull, ensuring that a new generation of American tankers would know who Poole was and what he had accomplished. The M1 Abrams is a very different machine from the Sherman that Poole commanded: 70 tons of advanced armor, a 120mm smoothbore gun, a turbine engine, and computerized fire control, but the principle is the same. Tanks are about aggression, about closing with and destroying the enemy, about the combination of firepower, mobility, and protection that enables ground forces to break through defensive lines and exploit the gaps. Poole would have loved the Abrams. He would have pushed it to its limits, as he pushed everything to its limits. Let's zoom out and consider the Poole in the context of World War II tank warfare more broadly. The war produced legendary tank commanders on all sides. For Germany, there was Michael Wittmann, whose Tiger tank wreaked havoc on British forces at Villers-Bocage in June 1944, destroying over a dozen vehicles in a single engagement. Whitman was credited with 138 tank kills and 132 anti-tank gun kills during his career, numbers that dwarf Poole's official total. But Whitman was operating a Tiger against often inferior Allied tanks, and he was killed in August 1944, his Tiger destroyed by a combination of British Sherman Fireflies and possibly Canadian tanks. For the Soviet Union, there was Dmitry Lavrenenko, credited with 52 tank kills in just over 2 months of combat in 1941, an extraordinary tally achieved while the Red Army was reeling from the German invasion. Lavrenenko was killed in December 1941, his career cut short before he could add to his record. But there was a problem with Japan's strategy, and that problem was geography. Japan needed oil to run its war machine. The oil came from the Dutch East Indies, modern-day Indonesia. To protect the oil shipments, Japan needed to control the sea lanes between Indonesia and the home islands. And to control those sea lanes, Japan needed to prevent the Allies from establishing bases close enough to threaten Japanese shipping. Australia was the obvious threat. If the Americans and Australians could build up forces in Australia and then establish forward bases in the island chains to the north, they could strangle Japan's oil supply. The Japanese solution was to push their defensive perimeter as far south as possible, establishing bases that would keep Allied forces at arm's length. And one of the most important positions in this defensive perimeter was a place called Guadalcanal. Guadalcanal is a mountainous, jungle-covered island in the Solomon Islands chain, about 1,000 miles northeast of Australia. In July 1942, American reconnaissance discovered that the Japanese were building an airfield there. If that airfield became operational, Japanese bombers and fighters could threaten Allied shipping routes to Australia. The supply line that kept Australia in the war would be cut. The strategic situation was clear. The Japanese could not be allowed to complete that airfield. Someone had to take it from them. The someone was the United States Marine Corps. On August 7, 1942, the 1st Marine Division landed on Guadalcanal in the first American offensive operation of the Pacific War. It was a chaotic, improvised assault. The Marines had limited intelligence about the Japanese strength on the island. Their maps were inaccurate. Their supplies were inadequate. When boldness met skill. In Korea, in Vietnam, in the Gulf War, American tank forces applied lessons that could be traced back to the hedgerows of Normandy and the pursuit across France. Poole didn't invent these concepts. They had roots in German blitzkrieg theory, British tank doctrine, and American cavalry tradition. But he demonstrated their validity in the crucible of combat, providing a living example that future tankers could study and emulate. The Sherman tank itself has been reassessed by historians in light of its combat record. For decades, the dominant narrative was that the Sherman was a death trap, hopelessly outclassed by German heavy tanks, a shameful example of American production over quality. More recent scholarship has nuanced this view. Yes, the Sherman was vulnerable to Tigers and Panthers, but it was also reliable, easy to maintain, available in vast numbers, in the hands of skilled crews perfectly capable of destroying German armor. The Sherman's thin armor and high profile were liabilities, but its mechanical reliability meant that Shermans were actually ready to fight when needed, unlike German tanks that spent disproportionate time under repair. Poole's career illustrates both sides of this debate. He lost 5 tanks to German fire, confirming the Sherman's vulnerability, but he destroyed over 250 armored vehicles and survived over 80 days of combat, confirming that crew skill could overcome equipment deficits. The truth, as always, is more complicated than simplistic narratives allow. The Sherman was neither an unqualified success nor an unqualified failure. It was a tool, and its effectiveness depended on how it was used. Let's talk about the men around Poole, not just the 3rd Armored Division. Spearhead was one of the most aggressive and effective American armored divisions in the European theater. Its commanders encouraged initiative and risk-taking to a degree that would have been uncomfortable in more conservative organizations. Poole operated in an environment where his bold tactics were tolerated and even celebrated, rather than suppressed as insubordinate. Not every division would have allowed a staff sergeant to commandeer replacement tanks and return to combat without orders. Not every division would have overlooked Poole's tendency to push ahead of supporting infantry and artillery. The 3rd Armored Division's culture of aggression gave Poole the space to be himself. Other tankers in the division, inspired by Poole's example, adopted similar tactics. The division as a whole achieved an outstanding combat record, in part because commanders like Poole set a tone that emphasized attack, attack, attack. This unit culture doesn't diminish Poole's individual achievement. He was still the tip of the spear, the most extreme expression of the division's ethos, but it provides context for understanding how he was able to do what he did. Lone wolves rarely thrive in military organizations. Poole succeeded because his wolfishness aligned with his pack's direction. The bond between Poole and his crew deserves special attention. Tank crews are forced into an intimacy that few military units experience. 5 men in a space smaller than a large closet, sharing body heat and body odor. Trusting each other with their lives in an immediate, physical way. Dysfunctional tank crews where members don't communicate, don't trust each other, or don't share the commander's vision perform poorly and die quickly. Functional crews operate as a single organism with 5 brains and 10 hands, each member anticipating the other's needs and compensating for their weaknesses. Poole built a functional crew through a combination of selection, training, and leadership. He chose men whose temperaments matched his aggressive, unflappable, and willing to take risks. He drilled them endlessly until their reactions were automatic, and he led them by example, never asking them to take a risk he wouldn't share. The crew repaid him with fierce loyalty. When Poole's 5th tank was hit and his leg was shattered, his crew didn't hesitate to drag him from the wreck under fire, apply first aid, and get him to safety. They saved his life as he had saved theirs countless times. After the war, crew members stayed in touch with Poole and attended reunions. The bonds forged in combat outlasted the war itself. Let's consider the German perspective on facing American armor in 1944. German tankers began the war with a well-deserved reputation for excellence. Their tanks were technically superior, their tactics were innovative, and their crews were well-trained. Early engagements against French, British, and American tanks often ended in lopsided German victories. But by mid-1944, several factors were eroding German armored effectiveness. First, attrition. German tank crews were being killed faster than replacements could be trained. New crews had far less experience than the veterans they replaced. Second, maintenance. German tanks, especially the Tiger and Panther, were mechanically complex and prone to breakdown. As the supply situation deteriorated, spare parts became scarce, and increasing numbers of German tanks were abandoned due to mechanical failure rather than combat damage. Third, fuel. German fuel supplies were under constant Allied bombing, and by late 1944, fuel shortages were critically limiting German armored operations. A Tiger without fuel is just an expensive pillbox. Fourth, morale. The relentless Allied advance, combined with casualties and material shortages, eroded German fighting spirit. Not universally, German units continued to fight with skill and determination in many engagements, but the confident swagger of 1940 and 1941 was gone. Against this backdrop, commanders like Poole seemed almost unfair. German tankers expected American armor to behave in predictably cautious advances, reliance on numerical superiority, and calls for air support before engaging. Poole violated all those expectations. He attacked when he should have defended. He closed the distance when he should have maintained a standoff range. He kept coming even when hit. German accounts of fighting Poole's unit described confusion and frustration as American tanks behaved in ways that defied tactical logic. The role of American industrial power in enabling Poole's success cannot be overstated. The Poole lost 5 tanks in 81 days of combat. In a German or Soviet armored unit, losing 5 tanks would have been catastrophic, irreplaceable equipment gone, experienced crew likely dead or wounded. For Poole, each loss was a temporary inconvenience. American factories were producing Shermans faster than German guns could destroy them. Replacement tanks flowed forward on trains and tank transporters, crewed by men fresh from training who could be integrated into experienced units. Poole exploited this abundance without hesitation. Tanks were tools, means to an end, expendable in pursuit of victory. This industrial abundance shaped American tactical thinking at every level. Commanders could afford to be aggressive because losses could be replaced. They could accept attrition ratios that would have crippled German or Japanese forces because American production capacity ground and ambush positions that other commanders missed. He could manage his crew under extreme stress, keeping them focused and coordinated when lesser crews fell apart. He had physical courage that bordered on recklessness, but was tempered by just enough caution to keep him alive. And he had psychological resilience, the ability to process trauma without being broken by it, to climb back into a new tank after watching his previous one burn. Not everyone has these attributes. Training can develop some of them, but much is innate. Poole was born to be a tanker the way some people are born to be musicians or athletes. The war gave him a stage, and he performed. The end of Poole's combat career was also, in a sense, the end of the era of the individual tank ace. World War II was the last major conflict where individual tank commanders could make a significant difference through personal combat. In subsequent wars, Korea, Vietnam, the Arab-Israeli conflicts, and the Gulf War, tanks remained important weapon systems, but the nature of combat changed. Engagements were increasingly decided by combined arms coordination, air supremacy, and advanced technology rather than by individual tank versus tank duels. The tank commander became a manager of systems rather than a personal warrior. Poole represented the end of something, the mounted knight of the industrial age, riding his steel horse in a battle, defeating enemies through skill and courage and aggression. After him, war became more distant, more technological, more impersonal. The tank ace became an anachronism. Poole's story also illustrates the randomness of combat and the thin line between survival and death. For 81 days, Poole defied the odds. He took risks that should have killed him, fought engagements that should have destroyed him, and somehow emerged alive. Then, on September 19, 1944, a German anti-tank gun got a clean shot and nearly took his leg off. What was different about that day? Was Poole careless? Did his luck simply run out? Was the German gun crew exceptionally skilled? We don't know. Combat is chaotic, and survival often comes down to factors entirely outside an individual's control: the angle of a slope, the timing of a shot, and the random variables that determine whether shrapnel hits an artery or misses by an inch. Poole understood this. In later interviews, he never claimed to be superhuman or invincible. He acknowledged that he had been lucky as well as skilled, that the same bullets that killed other tankers had somehow missed him until they didn't. This humility is common among genuine combat veterans. Those who have faced death know how arbitrary survival can be. The ones who claim to have been in complete control of their fate are usually those who never faced real danger. Lafayette Poole died on May 30th, 1991, in Huntsville, Texas, at age 71. Most of the men who tried to kill him and all of the tanks he destroyed. His last years were quiet, family, veterans events, and occasional recognition from the military community that remembered what he'd done. He never wrote a memoir, never sought publicity, never tried to cash in on his fame. He was, In the end, a private man who had briefly been thrust into extraordinary circumstances and performed extraordinarily well. The war made him famous. Peace let him be himself again. He's buried in Texas, not far from where he was born, in the flat open country that shaped him. His grave is modest, as he would have wanted. But for those who know the story, who understand what it means to destroy 258 armored vehicles and survive 5 tanks shot out from under you, who can imagine the terror and exhilaration of charging a Panther head-on in Sherman, the name Lafayette Poole carries weight. He was War Daddy, the unkillable commander, the man the Germans couldn't stop until, finally, after 81 days, they did. He was wounded but not broken, stopped but not destroyed, and his legend endures.